Right, so we've come to the second session of the educational part of talks, and we have the pleasure of having Kate Lockwood here. She's from California State, Monterey. Has come a long way to talk to us. We are very, very happy to have you here, Kate. And it will continue in the same theme as this morning. So we enjoyed the talk this morning on Linda, so it's just to continue and hear the rest of the story.
Great, thank you. Thank you for having me. This is a rough time slot. I don't not only have to follow Linda's talk, but also the safari. So I'll see what I can do, but I can't promise to be as entertaining as the giraffes. So the topic of my talk is innovative instruction in the CS classroom, why faculty aren't obsolete yet. And the sort of obligatory overview, I'll talk a little bit about my background on how I got interested in education in computer science. And then I'll talk about some of the innovative instructional techniques that I'm using or that are being used by colleagues of mine at other institutions. And hopefully I'll leave lots of discussion for talking about the opportunities available now for CS education. I actually have a couple of the same examples that Linda showed this morning, so if I speed through those, we should have plenty of time for questions and discussion. All right, so this is the background of sort of where I came from to arrive at teaching computer science. I went to the University of Michigan and then Northwestern University for my degrees, and so I was at these sort of well-established engineering schools, large classes, big student bodies, and I've now been teaching for 4 years at a teaching-centered institution. So while I grew out of the tradition of a research-based university, I now teach at a school that has about 5,000 students, and we only grant bachelor's and master's degrees. We don't grant PhDs. So our student population is pretty different. In addition to having kind of a different population, we teach 3 courses a semester. And of course, when I was interviewing, I said, no problem. I can easily teach 3 classes a semester. But then I showed up on campus and got the rosters of students in my classes and realized they were actual people that were going to show up and expect me to educate them, and had a little bit of a panic. And then I thought, well, how do we educate people in computer science? So when I was in college, we bought a textbook. The professor assigned us some readings from that textbook, which, maybe we did. Then we would go to class. The professor would go over what was in the reading that we had sort of done for that day, usually throwing transparencies of code up on an overhead projector. And we would sometimes try to scribble it down madly, and other times just, kind of smile and nod. And then we took exams, right? We took midterms and finals, and sometimes we had a project. And that was sort of how we learned computer science. And so I figured that's how everybody learns computer science, and that's how my students were going to learn computer science in my class as well. Although I was going to be progressive, and instead of using an overhead projector, I was going to use PowerPoint slides. Okay. So that was kind of my plan. Going into my first semester, I went to the guy that had taught my classes a semester before I taught them, and I said, well, what book do we order? And he handed down the PowerPoint slides, right, that had kind of gone from professor to professor as I taught these classes. And I figured, well, I would just add some cool examples, and then the sheer, energetic presence of myself in the classroom would inspire students to just love computer science. And I realized, this is sort of the educational model that I was perpetuating, that students arrive lacking some critical piece of knowledge. In my case, I teach a lot of introductory programming and data structures, so students were showing up with this missing chunk of knowledge. I was going to use my 2 class sections, so I had them for an hour and a half twice a week. I would use that time to just shove as much information about programming and data structures as I could into their heads. And then I would determine whether or not I'd been successful by giving them some exams and seeing how much of that information they could give back to me 3 times a semester. And that worked for some students. And I think that some of the resistance to kind of innovation in education is that system works for all of us, right? We're all either PhD students or postdocs or have PhDs in computer science, so we've been successful in this system. We successfully learned by lectures and successfully completed exams, probably sometimes more successfully than others, but this system works for us, and it worked for some of my students, right? But I had to realize that there's also a large percentage of my students for whom this wasn't working. I had students that were clearly unengaged during lecture. I would kind of look out over the sea of faces, and there'd be a couple students that were struggling to stay awake, a couple students who were taking notes furiously on their laptops, but probably not notes about what I was saying. I had some instances of copied homework where students just blatantly turned in things they had found on the internet, or and sometimes even like the way they would get caught is they would leave in hyperlinks that from the page they stole things from. Our intro programming class had a consistent fail rate of somewhere between 25 and 30%, and that was just standard, right? It's kind of expected. And one of the things that was really worrying to me is that I would hear these things from my students, things like, well, I'm just not good at computer science or computers, or I don't like computers. And one thing that a lot of my students said over and over and over again is, I can understand the concepts, but I can't then do the programming problems. So they felt like I would lecture at them about what a for loop was, and they felt pretty confident that they could then tell me right back what a for loop was. But if I asked them to solve a problem that required a for loop in the solution, they were really confused about how to get to that solution. So I kind of ventured out to look at, well, what other ways could I maybe be teaching the students that would reach more of these students and would help them actually make that leap from having a sort of vague notion of the concepts I was teaching to actually being able to use them in problem solving. And so I kind of reflected a little bit on why I taught the way I taught, and why we've developed lecturing as the main way that we teach computer science. And one phrase that you hear on some of the literature is this is the stage on the stage approach, right? And that made sense in, let's say, medieval times, or even much more recently than that, when universities were sort of the center of knowledge. Knowledge was localized in universities. If you wanted to learn something, you had to go to the university where the expert on that was. And lots of times, even advanced technical books would be kind of consolidated in university libraries. So it made sense that you went, and the most efficient way to transmit the information was for the expert themselves to, talk to an auditorium full of people. But if you think about what we have now, information isn't centralized any one place anymore. You can get information from a variety of sources. So, if you want to learn a new skill, you probably don't go to the library, right? You go to Google. Our washing machine broke, and so our first stop was YouTube, and we just Googled washing machine repair, right? And something that previously might have required an expert, or at least a trip to somewhere where we could gather expert resources, we were able to solve from the comfort of our own home using YouTube. Wikipedia, like it or not, that's where a lot of students get their information, and I'll admit that sometimes when I'm writing a paper and I forget how to implement a statistical method, I'll stop by Wikipedia to get the formula. Khan Academy, iTunes U, there's all these places now where information is available. And that presents some challenges, because now we can't rely on being the only way that our students can get the information we're trying to teach them. We don't have a monopoly on the knowledge anymore. So there are two ways to look at that. One way, and this is a reaction that I see a lot from some of my colleagues, is to set it up as, we have this class and the internet is just a distraction, right? There's all of this information out there. We don't want our students to do it. We're going to confiscate cell phones when students come into class. We're going to make them close their laptops. We're going to tell them they can't use online resources, right? We want them to respect our authority and come to class and do what we're asking them to do, which I think is probably a losing battle. I think that some of us may try to fight that battle, but you confiscate cell phones and someone's going to find another way to get online if they want to. Another, I think, equally destructive way to kind of think about this is that technology is just the answer to all of our problems, right? That if we throw enough random technology at the education problem, it'll be fixed. Right? And that all we have to do is, instead of trying to fix what we have, we'll just take what we have and put it online. Right? And that solves the problem, because now all the information students want is where they want it. Right? They could, instead of YouTubing cat videos, they can go YouTube C++. And we no longer need to teach the class. Right? So you kind of see people on these two extremes. Either we need to, restrict access to the technology, or we need to just go all in with technology. And sort of on the all in end of the spectrum is where we see the MOOCs, right? Which Linda also talked about a little bit this morning, these massive online courses. And Linda already, I think, did the poll that I was going to do to see how many people had registered for a MOOC versus how many people had actually finished or participated in a MOOC. I was actually part of a faculty group that together we registered for the MOOC. We were going to have these study groups. We were going to potluck dinner and do our homework. And we made it through like week 2 before we all dropped out. So one of the early MOOCs was Sebastian Thrun and Peter Norvig teaching AI online. And I come from an AI background, so I was really excited. This is one of the MOOCs I started and never finished. And it got me really thinking about this idea of this open online content. Because if one of my students could take artificial intelligence from Sebastian Thrun and Peter Norvig, who am I to argue that they should take it from me instead, right? But as I went through the first couple weeks of a couple different MOOCs, I realized that it's not exactly the same as being in a class, as having a professor. I think that maybe some of the predictions are a little maybe overblown. So you hear things like, because of MOOCs in 50 years, there will only be 10 universities left in the world. So one of my colleagues has a really pragmatic reaction to that he plans to retire long before then. So, come what may, he's fine. You also see statistics about cost savings, right? Which is a big thing right now in the US in education. And one of the reasons MOOCs have become a really prominent part of the education discussion is there are a lot of budget issues related to university level education. In the state of California, we have a huge wait list of students that can't get into our community college or our state college system. So a lot of people are saying that these online courses are the way to go. We'll just put it online. Everyone has access. Now anyone anywhere can have this world-class Stanford, MIT education. And furthermore, look at how much money it's going to save us, because now we can have one graduate teaching assistant, paid poorly, who can monitor 33,000 online students, right? Why are we paying faculty these exorbitant salaries to do what we can do with a computer and a grad student at much larger scale? And, there are some people who really think this is the direction things are going, and I think there are some really great things about MOOCs. There are also some downsides. So I think Linda also mentioned the Georgia Tech initiative to offer a master's degree completely online as a MOOC. And this is actually one place where I think they might have a little bit of traction. If you think about the people that are going to be interested in an online master's degree, they're probably people that already have some background in the subject, probably working, so they need a more flexible option to get a degree. And I'm not even going to really argue with the master's level kind of practical software engineering. Let's see how they do, right? Who wouldn't want a Georgia Tech master's degree for $6,000? That's a great deal in the US. But if you're looking at the sort of introductory level, bachelor's level student at the university, I think that we don't have to be worried about MOOCs putting us out of that business just yet. Again, some of the same data that we saw this morning. If you look at the people that start a MOOC versus the people that finish, in particular finish successfully, it's a very small percentage. And there are ways to get around this, but all of the experiments that have been successful in encouraging students to finish MOOCs have involved a huge investment in contact hours. So in the state of California, there was a pilot where they used a MOOC class to teach math remediation. So we again have a big problem in the United States with students that arrive at university not ready to do college level math. So we have to offer them remediation classes to get them up to sort of the basic level that we'd expect all college students to be. And it's a huge, huge financial investment for the university. There's hundreds of students that take it every year. And so a big state school experimented with using a MOOC. It was actually fairly successful. But if you look at why it was successful, it was because the students were enrolled in the online MOOC, but they were also enrolled in an in-person small class that met on campus with a TA that coached them through the homework and provided individualized support and checked in to make sure the students were completing the material and staying on track and were accomplishing their educational objectives. There's also been recently announced a big partnership between Coursera, one of the big MOOC organizations, and a variety of institutions in the United States. There's probably somewhere between 10 and 15 institutions that have signed on to use Coursera in their campus-based programs. But if you dig into the details of the agreement, they're not saying we're just going to send our students off to do your MOOCs and give them credit at our institution. What they're going to do is use the MOOCs to experiment with a blended learning model, right, which combines the online video lectures with some sort of on-campus, active, in-person interaction. So again, kind of taking the knowledge delivery part from the MOOC, but combining it with something in class that provides support for the students. So I think that this really gets at one of the great opportunities here. We can get maybe out of that knowledge transfer business, the filling of like an empty head with the facts that we need in our discipline, and focus on actually supporting students in class to really learn the material, to practice the material, and become experts at the material. And this makes sense if you look at how students learn. So there are two types of activities involved in learning when you're in a new discipline. There's acquisition, which is when students are acquiring knowledge. These are the facts, procedures, definitions of a new discipline, right? So the things that we might ask them to regurgitate back on a multiple choice exam. But then there's assimilation, where students actually learn how to use that knowledge that they acquired to solve practical problems. So this would be the things that we might ask students to do in projects or labs, where we give them a novel problem and they have to figure out, okay, well, of all this new vocabulary, these new procedures I know, how can I apply them to solve this problem? So it's, how do I take all these loops I've learned and then write a program that calculates a factorial? Or, to take a simple example from introductory programming. And there are lots of things. An example that I use, a metaphor I use in my classes when I'm teaching programming, is that this is a lot like how we learn to drive in the United States. You take a driver's ed class where you acquire the knowledge of what all the road signs mean and what the basic rules of the road are. But then you have to actually go through that assimilation step where you learn how to actually apply all of that in practice, where you get behind the wheel of a car and try it out. And the students all agree that they wouldn't want to be on the road with someone who had only learned about driving from hearing someone lecture about it. They realize in situations like sports or cooking or musical instruments, right, hobbies that students have, that there's an element of practice. And I think you can make the same case that programming is similar, right? Computer science is similar. When we rely too heavily on the acquisition, which is what MOOCs can provide us, what lectures can provide us, we miss out on the chance to really delve deeply into what's going on in the assimilation portion of learning. So just another little bit of motivation, I think, that drives home the difference between acquisition and assimilation, and the student and the instructor's roles. This is from actually a study that was looking at different ways to collect electrical brain activity. And so when you're a researcher at a university, you have a lot of willing subjects, undergrads, who will participate in your studies for free. And so what they did was they wired up a student 24 hours a day for a week and monitored his brain activity, right? Undergrad will do anything for $20, right? So, and what they saw was both encouraging and discouraging from an educational standpoint. So if you assume that high electrical brain activity corresponds to cognitive engagement, you can see that there are some really cool spikes when the student is studying, when he's in lab, and when he's doing homework, right? So that's what we'd want to see. The student is engaging with the material, struggling through how to solve problems, figuring out how to apply what he's learning to solve new problems. On the other end of the spectrum, the discouraging trend is what happens when the student's in class, which is essentially a flat line, right? The only other thing that kind of comes close is watching TV or doing chores, right? But even chores is apparently more mentally demanding than class. So again, right, I think what's going on here is the lecture class, right? This is the assimilation, the sort of just gathering of facts. And then this, in lab, where we're getting this sort of cognitive engagement and brain activity, is the assimilation, where students are actually trying to make sense of the facts that they've learned. So in a traditional class, if you think about what we spend our class time on, and we don't even get that much class time with our students. At my institution, a semester is 16 weeks, and we might have students in class for 3 or 4 hours a week. So if you do the math, that's, not very much time to try to get them to learn a whole new discipline or a whole new chunk of knowledge. And we basically spend that time on things that are either the input or output of acquisition. Lectures, exams, quizzes. We're either telling the students something or asking them to repeat what we told them. The sort of flatline type things. At home, we send them home to do the assimilation. So we say, yeah, we covered all of this in class. Now go home and do the tricky work of figuring out how to make sense of all this information, how to apply it to novel problems and novel situations. This is the harder stuff. This is the stuff students struggle with. This is why I have students that say, I feel like I understand the material, but I just can't write the program you're asking me for, right? They understand what I told them, they think they do because they can repeat it back to me when I give them a quiz. But when they're at home by themselves with no one to ask for help, they can't figure out how to use it in a novel way to solve a new problem. And for me at least, those are the skills that I care more about developing in my students, right? My classes are all prerequisites for higher level classes. So what I want to know is that my students are really good at programming at that problem solving part where they're actually breaking a problem down and coming up with a solution, and that they'll be able to apply that in their higher level classes. And also, if this is where the students are cognitively engaging, I want to be a part of that. I don't want to be a part of them leaning back in their chairs and zoning out and wondering how many more minutes till lunch, right? I want to be a part of them wrestling with these big ideas and learning how to use them to solve problems. So I wanted to look at what are some ways that I can bring more of this into my classroom so I can be there when my students are actually engaging with the material. So this is often referred to as going from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side, right? So more of a park ranger than a orator, right? You want to help the students make sense of the material and be involved in them actually exploring and becoming more confident and comfortable with the material. So 2 techniques that I'll cover in detail, and then I'll kind of gloss over a whole bunch of other things really quick, since I'm standing between you and cake. So one technique that I use a lot in my classroom is the inverted classroom. And I started doing this and then came across this really great example from Harvard, and I decided to use their pictures because their classrooms are a lot fancier than ours, and they clearly have a professional photographer. So this is an example of actually a discrete math for computer scientist class that's been flipped at Harvard. And I won't read these all to you, but the takeaway points from this professor describing his class is that he gives homework daily, and it's required to come to class, but then when students come to class, instead of listening to him talk, they talk to each other to solve problems collaboratively, right? And that he is seeing his role as becoming a coach instead of sort of this oracle of truth, right? Which is exactly how I think of the inverted classroom, right? We're going to take the knowledge acquisition the things that are more passive, do them at home, and then bring students into this active problem-solving environment in class with the professor acting more as a coach, as a mentor, as an example of how to do the processes that we're asking the students to do. So we're just going to flip, right? And we mean actually flip. So we're going to take the stuff we used to do in class, do it at home. So lecture, used to do it at class, now we'll do it at home. As much as possible, things like quizzes and exams, find a way to do them at home. And then bring into the classroom things like critical reading, problem sets, projects, things that used to be assigned as homework. And it doesn't have to be all or nothing, right? You can partially flip, you can take just parts that you want. And it also gives you a chance to think about what does it mean to give a lecture? What's the goal of a lecture? Does it need to be an hour and 30 minutes of me talking nonstop, right? If that's boring in person, just making it a video isn't going to make it any more exciting, right? I mean, once students get through the novelty of being able to watch it on their iPhone once, you know, it's still an hour and a half of me talking about for loops. So we can take advantage of the fact that we're completely changing everything anyway to look at how we address each of the individual elements of the class, right? So maybe we don't need an hour and a half of uninterrupted speaking in order to get across what a loop does. So I have 2 pilot classes that I've been working with. The first is our Introduction to Programming for Computer Science students and math students, which is taught in C++. So the way that I flipped it was at the same time that I was flipping, I just decided I would kind of do away with all of the assumptions I had about what you needed in order to learn, right? So if you go back to my original assumptions, my first semester teaching, I assumed the things I needed were a textbook and lectures, right? And that was how people needed to learn. So I decided if I was going to flip, I was also not going to have textbooks or lectures. So I created what I call an online workbook, but it's really just pages in Moodle. So we use Moodle as our learning management system, and they have a feature called a lesson that lets you package a bunch of things together in kind of one chunk on a Moodle page. So here's part of a chunk on for loops. Students have a little bit of text to read that maybe has an example. It's one paragraph. It's not a chapter in a textbook. They have a couple of videos that do things like it'll be me writing code, talking through what I'm doing, or using a tablet here to show like how to trace through a loop to see what the output of a loop is. And after each little chunk, which is about a paragraph of text and maybe 1 or 2 videos, the students have a couple basic comprehension questions to answer. So these are the kinds of things I might have asked on a quiz previously just to see if students were awake. All in all, the whole thing should not take that long. So my videos are between 3 and 6 minutes long each. So again, I've chunked things up into sort of individual topics as opposed to saying I'm going to teach you all of loops in one marathon lecture. The other good thing about doing this through a learning management system or doing it online is something else that Linda talked about earlier, learner analytics. So I'll talk more about this later, but I can actually see from Moodle which of my students have access to the workbooks, when they started them, how long they spent on them, and how many of the required activities they completed. Students have one of these before every single class period. So we have 30-ish meetings a semester, so I have about 30 workbooks. They do one before class every day. Then in class, I still occasionally give a quiz now and then, but I spend the time at the beginning of class on group problem solving. The students work in groups to solve a problem, and then different groups will present their solution, and as a class we'll talk about the differences between the solutions, what makes a good solution, if any of the groups have suggestions on how to improve the code from the group, and then they break apart into pairs and do pair programming labs. So all of the time in class now is spent on these active problem solving activities. And the instruction then is very individualized. So rather than getting up and saying, oh, a couple groups, are struggling at this one point, I'll go around and with each group, I can see where they're struggling. I can see what each student's kind of level of comprehension is. So that was going pretty well. I did it for a couple semesters. there wasn't a complete riot from the students. So I decided to try it with another class. But the downside of this is that, as you might guess, it's extremely labor intensive. It's really, really easy to take PowerPoint slides that come from a publisher, from another professor, and kind of flip through them before class and then get up there and talk about them for an hour and a half. It's much harder to go through and create something like this that the students are doing. And then to also, spend time crafting the in-class activities to really line up well with the homework that you've assigned. So we brought a new course into the curriculum, which was an introduction to Python. And it was aimed at non-computer science majors, although about half the class ended up being computer science majors anyway, just because they wanted to learn Python. And this time I was determined to use existing resources whenever possible. So when I did the C++ class, I recorded all my own videos, I wrote all my own text, I wrote all my own quiz questions, and got very little sleep. So when I was doing the Python class, I wanted to see, there's all this stuff out there, why not use it, right? Again, probably created by people with more knowledge and bigger budgets than I had, so why not take advantage of it? So I found online textbooks, and Code Academy, which Linda also mentioned, has interactive Python programming exercises. So for some exercises, I was able to link students to some of those, have them practice, and then come into class to do labs. And I also took advantage of some of the media computation resources out there from Georgia Tech, who have created the media computation Python class. So they have a lot of things out there, both that they created and that other people using the media computation curriculum have created. And so that actually just ran for the first time. It's just wrapping up. So, or just wrapped up before I came here. Our exams are at the end of May. And we're still kind of assessing some of the data from that class. But whenever I talk about these classes, the first question that I get from other faculty members is, oh, that's so nice, but, come on, they don't actually do the work, do they? I'm assigning these workbooks, these videos before they come to class, and, a lot of faculty have the same experience that I did at the beginning when I was assigning textbook readings, right? Maybe 50% of your students buy the textbook, being generous. And of the 50% that buy them, maybe 40% open the book at some point during the semester. And then the proportion that actually read it, a little bit smaller. And then the portion that actually knows how to read it and learn from it in an effective manner is a much, much smaller percentage even of that small group. So, if students won't read a textbook that they paid $200 for, why are they going to watch your YouTube video for free? And one thing I always say is that you have to kind of force the issue, right? The reason why students don't read the textbook is because we don't hold them accountable in any meaningful way for that material, right? And we don't provide them the support to learn how to do it well. So you just have to hold students to the material that you teach them. You have to make it painful to be in class the next day if they haven't done the material and just plow ahead. You can't say, oh, well, I see 40% of you didn't do the workbook again, so let me just recap what it went over, right? Kind of have to force them to buy in. And by the end of the semester, they are doing the work. So these are survey responses, so not a great sample because these are the students that voluntarily completed the survey, so probably some of the more motivated students in the class anyway. But ask them how often did they complete the workbooks before coming to class. And everyone answered always or most of the time, right? There was no one that admitted that they almost never watched the workbooks. Another thing that I thought was really interesting was I asked the students how often did they review a workbook after its due date to reinforce a concept or for clarification during lab. I think this is another really great side effect of making these materials available online, is that students can go back and review them. And sure, they could go back and review a textbook as well, but then they have to lug it around with them, right? If they can access the workbook on their phone or on their computer, they're much more likely, I think, to access them. And you can see that there was only one student who said they never referred back to a workbook. But a lot of students said, about half of the time or more frequently. So they were not only doing the work when it was actually assigned and they were getting graded on it, but they were also doing it later, again, an additional time to reinforce the material. And also just some of the questions that get at student attitudes, which I think is also really important. All of the students that responded strongly agreed that they liked that class time was spent doing hands-on problem solving. And when asked if they would prefer a lecture-based course, consider it a win that nobody said strongly agree. There were some agrees, some people that were like not completely on board by the end of the semester, but I would say that a lot of the students were neutral or better about being in the inverted classroom. It was difficult for both them and me at first because we've all gone through years and years of education where we've been conditioned that the way that you learn is someone talks at you. So there's a lot of kind of relearning on both sides to get used to this. But once students have kind of made it past the first 3 weeks, it seems to be the magical number. I work closely with a colleague of mine in math that's in a lot of inverted classroom and math classes. We agree that there's something magical about if you can make it through the first 3 weeks of class and students kind of learn how to learn in this environment, that it becomes very effective. Another technique that's been used with a lot of success in computer science is peer instruction. So the way that a peer instruction class works is that there's some sort of pre-class preparatory work, and I'm leaving that purposely vague. This could be inverted classroom type materials where students are, interacting with videos or quizzes, or it could just be textbook reading. It could be papers that they're asked to read, something to prepare for class. And then students come to class and a question is posed. And usually these are multiple choice questions, and students are asked to respond using a clicker or a mobile device that they already own. Notice this doesn't actually preclude using small chunks of lecture. Sometimes, rather than assigning a lot of pre-class preparatory material, peer instruction questions will be kind of scattered throughout a lecture. But what happens is you put the question up and you allow students to vote, right? So that's why you have multiple choice questions. Students can vote on the answers. Here's a sample from an introductory Python class. So, which of the following is best suited for a dictionary instead of a list? Give you a chance to read the possible answers. Who thinks it's A? B? C? D? All right. So this is a real peer instruction class. You'd be graded on your participation, and a lot of you would just fail. However, those of you that answered are ringers. The correct answer is C. Okay. So that's step one in peer instruction. If this was actual peer instruction, what then would happen is students would discuss their answers in small groups. So all of you that didn't vote, would want to make sure that you looked around and maybe grouped up with someone that was pretty confident about their answer. Okay? And the idea is that students can talk through their problem-solving process. They can discuss the reasoning behind the choices that they made. After an allocated chunk of discussion time, the question is reposed, the exact same question. The students are vote again, and this time, lots of time, usually the first vote isn't displayed for the class, but if you're using these clickers or a lot of the online student response systems, you can quickly get graphs that show the student responses. Lots of times you display the results of the second round of voting. And students are allowed to change their vote. In fact, we hope that a portion of the students change their vote based on the conversation. After the second vote, there's a class-wide discussion led by the instructor. So this is where, if there's a tie, say, on our question, the class was split between A and C, right? You might ask one group that had voted for A to volunteer to come up and explain their reasoning, maybe one group that voted for C to explain their reasoning. That works in a, medium-sized class. In a larger class, the instructor might have to revert to a little bit of lecture to explain the difference between, and why C is the right answer. But again, depending on the goals of the class and the size of the class, how that discussion goes is, dependent on the instructor. But the idea being that, the students spend a lot of their problem solving and sort of idea formation they do in this small group discussions. They're working together to make meaning out of the material that they either studied at home or learned in the lecture. So at UC San Diego, they did a really cool study where they have a lot of students, and so they had a lot of situations where there was an instructor teaching multiple sections of the same course. And so they had the same instructor teach one section using standard instruction and one section using peer instruction, and they looked at failure rates. And using peer instruction, and of course, these kinds of experiments are always, you can always come up with factors like, well, maybe one class was after lunch and the other class was in the morning, or, the students were different, but since it was the same semester, same teacher, trying to hold as much as possible the same and just varying whether or not peer instruction was used, there was a statistically significant difference in fail rate using peer instruction. So more students were able to successfully complete the class when peer instruction was added. And that might be counterintuitive at first, because if you think about it, that means that you're actually spending less time lecturing in your class. And so a lot of people would say, well, how can I possibly cover what I need to cover if I'm spending less time lecturing at the students? And the idea is that you just need to cover the same material, but switch the balance of what's happening in the classroom versus what students are responsible for on their own. But I think this is a really great result that shows the power of incorporating some of these techniques into your class. The other great thing about peer instruction and peer instruction in computer science is that there are a lot of existing resources out there. So while sometimes incorporating these things in your class can seem really overwhelming, like, oh my goodness, now I'm going to have to come up with all of these peer instruction questions, and I'm going to need 5 for every class. If I teach 30 classes, that's 150 questions, and I'm done, right? But there's this great resource online, Peer Instruction for CS, and the folks that run the site have compiled a bunch of the comprehension questions that you can use. So you can actually download the questions right from the site to use in your class. They also have links to a lot of their research papers, including the one that I cited, showing the benefits of peer instruction. They have a blog about peer instruction. A lot of really great resources if you're thinking about using peer instruction in your classes. So they've saved you a lot of work if you're interested in peer instruction. It's a really great resource. And in fact, some of their resources combine inverted classroom with peer instruction. So they have some resources on the kinds of at-home homework kinds of things that you can assign to your students to prepare them to participate in the peer instruction activities when they get to class. So there are a lot of other innovations in the classroom or educational techniques that we could go into if we had kind of unlimited time. One that I know that you, hearing the talks yesterday, you guys have experimented with yourselves is problem-based learning, where students, instead of telling them, here's all the stuff you need to know, here's a carefully constructed problem with a single solution, go figure out what solution I want and bring it back, you give students an open-ended question. So when I was in graduate school at Northwestern, they actually had a really great program for the engineering students where, as a senior project, groups of students were paired with a disabled, someone that was disabled, and they had to solve a problem for the disabled person. So a lot of it depended on, one was someone who was an amputee and wanted to be able to crack eggs, right? So they had to figure out, how do you build a device that lets someone with no use of their hands crack an egg? And so there were these very specific problems for a specific person who had a specific need, and there's no right solution. The idea was that they had to do the research themselves to figure out how to bring all of this engineering knowledge that they'd acquired over 4 years at university to solve this specific problem that wasn't covered in a textbook, that there was no existing solution for. They also had a spin-off class where students did, they did biology-inspired designs. They looked to the natural world for inspiration to solve engineering problems. And again, the idea being that they spent the whole semester on one problem, very open-ended, and had to themselves, define the problem, define the resources they need, go out and find the knowledge and solve the problem that way. Another technique is pair programming. So I mentioned this briefly. It's more than just working with partners. I think a lot of people are like, oh sure, I do pair programming, my students work in groups. That's not really pair programming. Pair programming is a highly structured way for students to work together with a partner in a programming class. And there are a lot of resources out there for that as well. NCWIT, which is the National Center for Women in Information Technology in the US, has, they call it pair programming in a box. You can download it right from their website, and it's all the materials you need to get started with pair programming in a class, including research that shows how to effectively use pair programming. There's also a lot of work in peer review or incorporating peer code reviews into programming courses, which is, I think, really interesting, and especially, using industry-level tools to have students do a code review of other people's code and provide feedback at that level to someone else. Being able to understand someone else's code often shows a really deep understanding of what's going on. And I listed these under other innovations and techniques because, as with the peer instruction and inverted classroom, I think you can kind of mix and match, right? Maybe you want to do pair programming and peer instruction, or you want to do problem-based learning in inverted classroom. You can really kind of think about, what are my learning objectives for my class, right? And then how can I use these techniques and the technology that's out there to best support my learning objectives? Another really big trend right now in computer science is to change the focus of a programming class. So instead of saying, I'm going to teach you intro programming, which sounds kind of dry, right? So I'm going to teach you intro to game programming, or I'm going to teach you intro to mobile development, or intro to robotics, or media computation, right? So there's all these themed sections of intro programming now, which I think are great, but I think that you have to be a little careful. You can give a really boring class on game programming, right? It can be a super exciting topic, but if you're lecturing at students for an hour and a half about game programming, you're still lecturing at them for an hour and a half about programming. So I think that these are really effective when they're combined with other instruction techniques to actually keep students engaged, not just with the overall topic of the class, but with the day-to-day material. It's the same, when you're talking about what language you want to use, right? I don't think that there's anything inherently more exciting about learning C++ over Java or Java over C++, but how you actually present the material to the students is what I think makes the biggest difference in how they learn, how motivated they are to continue the material, and how engaged they are with the discipline of computer science. Okay, so that was sort of an overview of some of the innovations that I've experimented with in my classes and kind of how I came to experiment with them. And some of the things, as I've been reading more and more about this area, that I've kind of pulled out as commonalities of successful innovations or successful implementations of innovations are the incorporation of frequent, low-stakes, formative assessments. So things like the clicker questions, and just giving credit. Did students answer all the clicker questions in a peer instruction classroom, right? They get a point every day that they do that, right? It's a chance for them to check their understanding in a low-stakes way with immediate feedback, right? And it's frequent, it's daily. In the workbooks that I assign, there's multiple choice questions every single day. Students get a chance every single day to check their understanding. And again, they get credit, no credit. They get credit just for doing it, right? You have to somehow provide some materials for home study, and I left it purposely vague. But I think the key there is that you need to hold the students responsible for those materials, right? So if you are going to assign something like a video or a reading or anything for students to do at home, and tell them it's important, then you need to back that up with what's important to students, the currency of the classroom, which is points, right? And then you have to actually give them a way to use that material in class the next day. They incorporate some kind of hands-on in-class problem solving, right? Whether that's actual hands-on programming or it's talking to a peer in peer instruction, there's something that you do in class that's active. It's part of that assimilation. It's not just sort of passive acquisition of new facts. And one thing that you see again and again is opportunities for collaboration, which is something that I think I've been guilty of not incorporating into my classes enough. It came out of an engineering tradition where on everything that we turned in, we had to sign an honor code saying that we hadn't worked with another student, right? And I think that when I first started, I was the same way. It's like, I want to know what you know, right? So none of this talking to your partner business. But I think that actually, if you are careful about assessment and assessing student learning, that collaboration is actually really a powerful way to learn in computer science and other disciplines as well. And the biggest takeaway of all for me, at least, was getting away from this idea that education is content delivery, right? If you believe that the entire job of an educator is to kind of fill an empty brain with knowledge in your discipline, then you might be a little bit more worried about being replaced by a MOOC sometime soon. But if you look at really the role of an educator as more of a coach or a mentor, someone who curates the material and then helps the student really assimilate it into their knowledge base, then you're not likely to be replaced by whatever. This was an early prediction about what learning would be like in the year 2000. So luckily that did not, turn out to be the truth. And then just kind of what I think I've learned. Again, I admitted on the first slide, I've been teaching for 4 years. So who knows what I'll learn in the coming years. But that instructors still have a very valuable role to play. It's just not the role that I thought it was when I started. So the important thing I can do is not stand up and share my vast knowledge with my students via lecture, but it's to really involve them in becoming active learners and taking ownership of their own learning. It's to use whatever opportunities I can to encourage students to learn through doing instead of listening. That when I assign homework, I need to hold students accountable. And I need to also hold myself accountable, right? Because if students come into class not having done the preparatory material, it's so much easier to just give them a quick lecture than it is to actually plow through the lab that you had planned, even though a third of the students are unprepared. I learned to view technology as a means, not an end. So I try to be really mindful of not getting too excited about new gadgets like iPhones or Google Glass. How can I put it in my class, right? Like just because I want a new toy. But to really think about what are my educational objectives, what am I not doing as well as I think I could be, and then how can I use technology to help me improve in that area of my teaching. And then the last thing that I've learned is to borrow liberally from others, that there's a lot of really great material out there, and we all have limited time. So to not let the startup costs of recording videos or making clicker questions be what prevents me from trying some of these things, to use what's out there and give attribution to the source when necessary, and to realize that that's not me outsourcing my job, that's me just switching my role, right, to being more of that curator and that guide and that mentor to my students, and to think of it the same way as I would using a textbook that I didn't write. Right? It's the same if I use a video that someone else created, the analog is using a textbook that I didn't write. Okay, so I guess I left 4 minutes for questions and discussion. I thought it was going to be longer, but if anyone has questions or discussion.